This is the story of Melissa Tremblay. Melissa Tremblay was born on March 1st, 1977, in Lawrence, Massachusetts. She was just 1 month old when her biological parents gave her up for adoption. She was adopted by Janet and Robert Tremblay. She grew up in a nearby town of Salem, New Hampshire. She was very energetic. She loved fashion, she loved to sing, and she had a true passion for reading. Melissa had so many friends at school, and she spent a lot of her time at the Boys and Girls Club. At just 9 years old, her parents divorced. Her father hasn't been involved in her life since some time. Her mother is considered a single parent. Her mother had a boyfriend. After some time, her mother got a boyfriend, and her mother's boyfriend's name is Ronald. Ronald and Janet would frequently meet up in Lawrence at like a local bar, and they would spend time together. That was not unusual for Melissa to be there and just hang out outside with other kids in the neighborhood. Melissa had also, got a couple friends around the area, a couple kids. All four of them lived in one house. And on this particular day, on September 11th, she went over to see if they could play, but they were on punishment. They had gotten in trouble, and they were unable to come outside. So, of course, Melissa was a little sad, but she just went back and found something else for her to do. On this particular time when they came, the bartender was going to make Melissa some popcorn. So she let her mom know, like, hey, Mom, they're going to make me some popcorn. I'm going to come back and check in in a little bit. Because what Melissa would do is she would go outside, play, come back in, and, give her mom an update. Then she'd go back outside and play again. So Melissa went outside. Janet went and looked in the car, noticed that she wasn't there. And then her boyfriend at the time, Ronald, was looking around too, like, okay, she can't be too far. Let's figure out where she is. They searched for 5 hours. And then Janet was like, you know what? We're going to have to get the police involved. She was getting nervous about what was going on. So it was already dark, and it made their task much difficult to try to find her searching at nighttime. They searched well late into the night. The possibility that she might have run away, but her mother insisted that Melissa was afraid of the dark and didn't like being alone, so she would never have run off. The next day, Melissa's whereabouts were still unknown, and the search continued. They went up until 3:00 p.m. on September 12th, when a railroad worker called the police. He had been conducting a routine inspection of an old railroad yard just a few hundred yards from the bar. But he had noticed something peculiar underneath one of the empty box carts. And between there, the worker had noticed when he got a little closer that it was a human body. And he immediately called the police. Detectives arrived at the scene and quickly identified the body as Melissa. Aside from the fact that she had been reported missing from the previous day, they noticed that it was her because inside of her purse, she had her Boys and Girls Club ID. The body of Melissa was lying on the tracks that were still being used, and one of her legs had been severed, mainly because of a passing train. The lead detective noticed several details that contradicted this theory. Melissa's purse containing the card with her name was almost 20 yards away from the body. And that definitely seemed strange, as it was unlikely that the train accident could have thrown the purse so far away. The detective also noticed a large number of footprints and drops of blood near the purse. This led him to suspect that Melissa might have been attacked, and only then her body was moved to the tracks to make it seem as if it was that. But it's definitely some foul play going on in some type of way. Melissa's body was sent to the medical examiner, while the police began searching for clues since no useful evidence was found at the scene where Melissa was discovered. Those investigators focused on finding witnesses to piece together the timeline of the events. First, they spoke with an employee of the railroad, and he mentioned that on that day before the body was found, he saw a girl fitting Melissa's description near the tracks. He told her to leave immediately because it was an unsafe place for children to be at. She left the area. She didn't protest. She just went ahead and left. A woman living not far from the bar said she had known Melissa for several months because her children had become friends with her, and she often would come visit their house to play with the kids. Her children was grounded at the time, so they were able to put the timeline together, but they were not able to play together. So the first significant lead, he reported saying a girl resembling Melissa was standing next to a van at an intersection near the railroad talking to the driver, and the witness described this man as a rather large, unkempt, around 30 years old, with dark hair and a large beard, in the van. And it was like a little old brown, dusty van. The Rusty police considered that this man might be connected to the murder and started searching for similar vehicles. Meanwhile, the medical examiner finished their report and confirmed that the train was not the cause of death for Melissa's body. It had numerous bruises and 3 fatal stab wounds. No foreign biological samples on her body or clothing or anything like that. She was stabbed and hurt. However, they still only had one lead: the description of the van near Melissa shortly before her disappearance. The police concentrated on finding a similar vehicle in the area, but repeatedly hit dead ends. The challenge was that even if they found the right van linking the owner to the murder, how would they be able to really prosecute them if there's no DNA evidence anywhere? Melissa's belongings and her fingerprints likely to be found on the van if they were able to find it. New witnesses that came forward gave interviews. Several of them were residents in the area, but the efforts was not helpful. It didn't bring any more information. It wasn't able to give any more detail. They're just still searching for this van. That's all they could really go off was the van. So it made Melissa's case become cold. It's crazy because it received so much media coverage, and many people began to blame her mother for what happened. And they were outraged that Janet let her 11-year-old daughter wander the streets alone, especially near such a dangerous place, the railroad area. Janet had developed a drinking problem after her divorce and was struggling with her parental responsibilities. People also started blaming social services for failing Melissa by not intervening in the situation amid that the accusations that Janet refused to speak with media. She was trying to get justice for her child, but all the blame was getting placed on her for things that didn't necessarily correlate to what was going on with trying to find her daughter. They were aware of the family's complicated situation and had tried to take some measures, but revoking Janet's parental rights had never been considered. Since then, there have been no progress in the case. Repeatedly reviewed and examined potential things, it was a dead end. There was no results. And 12 years after the murder, investigators identified their first potential suspect as Tommy Lynn. Tommy Lynn confessed to 22 murders. And the investigators was wondering if Tommy was a part of this one as well. Tommy resembled the van. He had a van that was similar to that. And a lot of his victims, kind of had the same thing going on with them. Melissa's murder He was not involved in Melissa's murder. So I know like they were convinced that it had to be him, but unfortunately, Tommy was able to clear his name from that particular situation. On a related case from Lawrence, during the questioning, he did suddenly claim to know some details about Melissa and the man that could have murdered her. So in the year of 1988, when he was just 13 years old, he used to steal cars and sell them to a local lot. Melissa's disappearance, he said he saw a girl similar to her, and she was sitting on the steps of that same bar, and then next to her was a man named Mike. And the witness knew Mike, but his family had warned him to stay away from that man because of his questionable reputation. The boy walked past them, and about 10 minutes later, on his way back, he saw the girl leaving the bar with Mike. At some point, another man whom he didn't recognize approached him, and the three of them continued walking together. The police asked the eyewitness why he maintained his silence for 25 years. He replied that at the same time he didn't want any unnecessary contact with the police. However, when he learned that Melissa's murder and realized he might have seen her, he asked his brother if he should tell someone, but he advised him to stay quiet because the detectives immediately would assume that he had some kind of connection to the situation. So, they saw some immediate, serious contradictions in the story, according to the witness. He saw the girl on the bar steps when it was already dark outside, but Melissa was reported missing at around 4 p.m. when it was still light outside. Given that all the bar patrons and staff were aware of her disappearance and her mother had been searching for her for hours, the detective found that it was highly unlikely that Melissa could have been right outside of the bar without being noticed, and the police considered the possibility that the witness had either seen a different girl or his account was inaccurate. Despite this, they investigated Mike for potential involvement, but made no progress. Nevertheless, the witness's story brought renewed attention to this old case. And in 2014, it was reopened. By then, DNA analysis was widely used, and the police hoped that their experts would be able to find new clues to re-examine all the evidence that they had previously. On Melissa's clothes, they didn't really find anything linking any other DNA. Other items are not found any type of foreign DNA either. It does show that Melissa had scratched her attacker, and experts analyzed these samples and indeed found traces of a foreign skin particle underneath her nails, which were probably sent to the lab. They probably sent them to the lab, but they couldn't find any male that actually matched that description. So at that time, it was determined that they were unable to find the perpetrator again. Now, through meticulous work, they managed to find a possible distant relative of the sample owner in the database. This led them to a specific family member with the last name McClendon. Detectives began investigating the members of this family, trying to determine who might have committed this crime. This process took several years due to primary challenges, the lack of completed DNA. Among them, they could have found Lawrence in 1988, and it matched the criteria, like the age, and there were two brothers, one named Marvin, and Marvin lived in Alabama, but investigators discovered that in the late 80s, he lived just 20 minutes away from Lawrence and worked as a carpenter, that he frequently visited a church located just 100 yards from the bar where Melissa had last been seen. Marvin had always worked as a prison guard for over 30 years, but with breaks in between, the intriguing findings didn't stop there from looking a little further into Marvin's own old brown van during those years, which he used for work. Despite this, Marvin had had no criminal history, aside from the numerous traffic violations. So it made it a little difficult to try to place Marvin there. But they kept searching. They kept doing more investigative work. So in 2015, Melissa's mother passed away at 70 years old. She was struggling from a severe illness for a long time and never found out who killed her daughter. After gathering all the information on Marvin and checking with other relatives, detectives concluded that he was most likely the perpetrator. And in 2021, they went to Alabama to question him about the time in the late 80s. Eventually, they brought up the murder of Melissa, and Marvin claimed he had nothing to do with it. When told that DNA from one of his close relatives were found on the victim, said that the killer might be his brother, Marvin voluntarily provided his DNA sample, but experts still couldn't establish a complete match or a partial. So Melissa's nails only indicated that Marvin was either closely related to the killer or was the killer himself. However, investigators who had already examined all his close male relatives knew that none of them could have committed the crime, leaving Marvin as the prime suspect. They also understood that without a full DNA match, it would be extremely challenging for the prosecution to secure a confession. As a result, they spent another year trying to find any additional clues. Detectives also checked Mike, the man who was 13 years old, the boy who claimed to have seen a girl resembling Melissa on the bar steps that night. Obtaining his DNA sample, experts determined that it did not match the skin particles. Marvin allegedly made a suspicious remark during his arrest. He told one of the officers, "At least I got to enjoy 20 years of my pension." Marvin, who was 74 years old at the time, was sent to jail awaiting trial, and the judge had placed him under constant protection because other inmates quickly learned about his charges and the fact that he had worked as a prison guard. Without concluding evidence, the prosecution relied on the process of elimination when it came to the DNA from someone in Marvin's family. They also pointed out that in 1988, Marvin frequently visited a church on the same street as the bar, owned a similar van, and matched the description given by the witness who saw a girl near his vehicle. The trial began in December 2022. Marvin's lawyer immediately focused on the lack of complete DNA profile of the perpetrator, claiming that without that, there is no guilt. The jury began their deliberations, and it took almost a week. But by December 27th, they reported being unable to reach an unanimous decision. Some of the jurors felt that without a complete DNA profile, they couldn't definitively convict Marvin, leading the judge to declare that this has to be a mistrial. And in early 2024, the prosecution announced plans to do a retrial and set to begin in September of 2024. Until then, Marvin will remain in jail, considering that he is 76 years old now and suffering from multiple health issues. There's a possibility he might not survive until the end. The new trial, if the court fails to convict him again, Marvin could be released, leaving Melissa's murder to be unresolved, and we may never learn the truth from that day.
Former Massachusetts correctional officer not guilty of killing an 11-year-old New Hampshire girl back in 1988. The body of Melissa Ann Tremblay was found at the Old Boston and Maine Railway Yard, in Lawrence, Massachusetts, 36 years ago. Marvin McClendon Jr. was arrested at his home in Alabama in 2022, and his first trial last year ended in a mistrial.